cream of chicken with herb soup. I like soup, and every year I have to go through my cupboard and through my pantry and find all the items that are leavened, the things which are not permitted to be in our possession during the time of Passover. I really like the soup. However, it has to go because it has legitimate leavening in it. I think they use it to make the soup creamy. But we look at other items also. I'll look at my cornbread mix. And this is not a commercial for the brand, but Krutsky's is a kosher brand. It's Kof K. And when I look at the ingredients on it, it says leavening, bracket, baking soda, and bicarbonate soda. Okay, a baking powder, bicarbonate soda. Those are acceptable. Matter of fact, if you went to the Krutsky's website, okay, you would find that it'll give you a group of recipes in which you can use their cornbread mix for Passover itself. I think a lot of the confusion comes on the Chametz issue. When we realize that oftentimes we're interjecting so many different English terms that it becomes confusing. When we use the word yeast, or when we use the word leavening, it does become confusing. Because the term chametz is quite specific and only pertains to 5 grains, to oat and rye and wheat and barley and spelt. Those are the 5 grains. Now, other grains may have fermentation taking place, but chametz is when one of those 5 grains comes in contact with water and creates a biochemical reaction of fermentation. The fermentation is chametz. Now, we all use yeast in bread when we're making our bread, in our dough, in order to get it to react to the flour. Thus, the yeast, the living agent, becomes part of the fermentation process, and we have chametz. But I say there are things oftentimes that are confusing. It's because we're using the term yeast, and it's because we're using the term leavening. Take for an example, in my cornbread mix, it said leavening on the back, and then it defines it as baking powder and baking soda, which are minerals. They're not chametz. They're not leavening. Rabbi Barry Dov Lindner, okay, who's with the Foundation of Family Education, okay, wrote an article in 2006 in the New York Times about leavening. And there he describes, once again, that only the 5 grains create chametz. That other agents which are used for leavening are permissible. And did you know, by chance, that in Israel, during the time of Passover, baking powder and baking soda are really quite popular in order to continue creating those wonderful desserts and semi-breads. I say semi because, remember, it's supposed to be matzah when you talk about bread. Now, when we look at things which are leavening or chametz, I could compare beer and wine for an example. Beer and wine, they both use yeast and they both are fermenting, but they're not the same when it comes to Passover. Let me give you an example. Beer is a wheat-based product, and thus the yeast that is used is a grain yeast from the 5 prohibitions, from the oats and the rye and the wheat and the barley and the spelt. So beer is not kosher for Passover. Now you can buy Passover hard liquor and Passover wine, but not beer because of the 5 grains. But compared to wine, on the other hand, wine is also a fermented drink. It also uses yeast, but the yeast is not from the 5 grains. In fact, if it was the same, how could we have the 4 cups of wine during Passover? We would have the 4 cups of grape juice. No. I'm glad it's a different type of yeast. I don't know if you've ever seen in the grocery store, like the Concord grapes or the dark grapes, and they kind of have a little film on them. That is the natural yeast that comes from grapes. Now, you add that and cane sugar together, you got kosher wine. But beer is from grain and grain yeast. Wine is from fruit and fruit yeast. It's 2 different things. It's apples and oranges, and should not be considered the same. I took the time to look into the Jewish encyclopedia for the word chametz, because once again, I wanted to avoid using leaven and the term yeast in a broad sense. The Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 says that chametz is the fermentation that creates sour or bitter. So, if you ever wondered where sourdough bread came from, well, it's Jewish, of course. And when you have that fermentation taking place, you have chametz, you have bread that will rise. In the olden days, back in the day, people used to say, well, they had starter. That was dough in which they had permit to completely ferment. They'd add a little piece of that, their starter, to their new dough mix and work it all the way through. And as the New Covenant would say, a little leaven from the starter leavens the whole lump. So when Israel was told to get rid of its chametz, its fermentation, they did, because they were to eat the bread of haste. There was no time for the bread to rise. Some people are confused and think, well, I got to get rid of all the flour in my house. I got to get rid of all the spelt and all the wheat and all the oats. Then what do Jews eat on Passover? What do they make their matzah from if they have no flour? Matzah is a combination of water and salt and flour. And once the flour becomes dampened, it must be cooked within the 18 minutes. In several articles which I came across, one, as I said, from the New York Times, it talks about the process. And the process of the 18 minutes, it came about because a person should be able to walk the distance of a Roman mile. Walk the distance of a Roman mile in 18 minutes. So what they would do, they would simply make their dough and they'd get about the work and would not go any greater than the distance of a Roman mile. And that's where the 18 minutes came from, by the way. But Passover is meant to be seen as the time in which we are being liberated, not restricted. If you look at Manischewitz particularly and some of their products, as well as Krutsky's, for an example, these kosher products are producing more than 500 new items every year for Passover. Matzo balls. I like matzo balls. This year, there's a tri-colored matzo balls. You can get them in green and the traditional, anyway, and red, because it's made out of spinach and tomatoes and matzah in the traditional sense. Because the rabbis want the people to realize that the truth is, it's not a burden to keep the Passover. They've been quite concerned with that for a long period of time. Now, Rabbi Shlovick said, concerning baking soda and baking powder, it's just minerals. I love his quote. What do we have to do with minerals? And he's talking in one of his dictations on the halakhic process. Now, he just happens to be, by the way, one of the chief rabbinates for the Orthodox Union and their kosher council. So when you stop and you think about kosher and Passover, keep it simple. Some people go so far as not only to remove the flour and the wheat and the oats, but they'll remove the beans and the rice. Okay? The guns. Well, in 1960, in New York, the Rabbinical Council, OU, declared that naguns were acceptable for Passover. Now, this is really an Ashkenazi tradition to get rid of them, and some still do. But in Israel, and I don't know if you're any more kosher than Israel, it's quite common to find beans and rice and such during the week of Passover, because it is not chametz. It is not from the 5 grains only. So people say, well, rice ferments. Yes, but rice is not of the 5 grains. Corn, like corn on the cob corn. Okay, that's not one of the 5 grains. It's an acceptable food. Cornbread, marvelous for Passover. I don't know if you're like me, but matzah has a tendency to bother me a little bit. But the reality is, in all this, is that Passover is good. Now, I've heard people complain about the stringency. Well, if you're keeping the fences of the Torah, the stringency, you're automatically keeping the fullness of the Scripture. If you wish to be more stringent and remove your oats and your flour and such, great. May God bless you for your stringency and for your desire to keep the Torah in the fullest capability that you have. Okay, but be patient with other people's stringency. Okay, if I'm eating cornbread, don't be offended. It's acceptable. Now we're going to take a little trip and go into the kitchen. I'm going to show you a few things there. So if you would, join me in the kitchen. And here we are in the kitchen, and it's time to talk about Passover from this perspective. Got to have your coffee, though. Did you know 99% of all coffee carries a kosher seal? Just a side note, that was a free one. But when we start thinking about our kitchen and cleaning our Passover, of course, we're going to get rid of our traditional breads and rolls and buns and even desserts. Matter of fact, this year was kind of difficult for us, for Roxanne and myself, because we got married in September and we keep the top layer of the cake, like a lot of people do, for your 1-year anniversary. And Roxanne comes to me a couple of weeks ago and says, we got it in the freezer. Well, she was right. So we celebrated our 6-month anniversary, roughly, okay, by having our wedding cake. That way we removed it from our presents here. But the idea of going through your cupboards and through your pantries and your shelves and your drawers and such is to remove all the chametz. The whole concept of spring cleaning came from Passover. So one opens their cupboards and they clean them out and remove all the dishes and make sure there's no hidden crumbs, and they'll open the drawers and clean off the countertops, and of course in the stove they'll reach down and they'll clean inside of it. And if you got a self-cleaning oven, you turn that baby on and it heats up, and when you're done, you come and wipe out the ash. And that's good. But the issue still often remains is what is chametz, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. The rabbis have determined there are 3 types of chametz. Remember, I'm not saying yeast, I'm not saying leavening, I'm saying chametz. 3 types of dough that's gone through the fermentation process. One type is what we would traditionally use for bread, okay, and that's when we consider the yeast. But another type of chametz, like, where it is, my special soup Anyway, that particular type of chametz is an ingredient, not the primary item. And the third type of chametz, which is mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, is the chametz which is not for human consumption, but is used as a paste, at least it used to be used as a paste, for those who were bookmakers in order to seal them together. Chametz 1 and Chametz 2, which are used for human consumption, well, those have their limitations. Those have to go. They must not be in our vicinity, in our property or place during the time of Pesach. But if you're a bookmaker, fear not. The chametz which you use for the books, according to the Shulchan Aruch, the definitive Jewish law, says that's acceptable to have in your presence. Now, we talked a little bit about beer and wine earlier, and here are a couple of traditional beers, which, by the way, I don't drink beer, but I have it on hand occasionally for my guests. These have to go. They're wheat and grain chametz in their orientation. So all beer, you're done with that. But then you have wine. Now, wine is unique because you have to pay very close attention to the label. Let me show you what I mean. Not all wine that we use for our daily consumption as Jews, not all of it is kosher for Passover. Take Chametz, unquestionably a kosher company. But if you would note this little part right here, right there beside the kosher OU, that says, if you can't read it, not for Passover use. And that's because some wines, though kosher, are not always usable for Passover. For example, this particular Chametz Concord grape was used, they used a grain yeast as well as corn sugar. Thus, though it's kosher for Jewish consumption, 51 weeks out of the year, there's 1 week in which it's not. Now let me show you another. Now this is also the same company, Chametz, but here you see the circle U, but there's no extra writing because this is kosher for Passover. Once again, the other one was not kosher for Passover because they used a grain yeast to enhance it, where this is strictly a fruit yeast bottle of wine. So wine, you have to be careful of. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but not all wines are kosher, so stick to a brand name unless you know them real well. Homemade wine is also kosher as long as you follow the fundamental rules. But when you're cleaning your house and you're preparing for Passover, there's no issue with fruit. There's no issue with your corn chips. By the way, nachos are great for Passover. And once again, things like peanuts. Peanuts is a legume. It's not actually even a nut. It's a bean, for sure. So you can have peanuts. You can have your cornbread for Passover. Now, in my house, what we do, we go through the cupboards and we find all the stuff that is questionable. We pull it out and we put it all in a big box. Now, 1 pound of dry yeast, that's questionable. But anyway, we pull it all out and we look at it, we confirm, then we put it in the box, and for the 2 weeks before Passover, we began to direct our diet around the box in order to use up as much as possible. That way there's less financial loss. But when you set up, I'm going to set this over here. When you set your house up for Passover, there's often a game that's played at the end of the day if you have children. And that's where the parent goes to the house and they will actually hide chametz, or bread. And the children are expected to find it. And for a couple of dollars, you can even buy a Passover, a chametz search kit, which is a little feather and the description of chametz. And sometimes they have a little box because in theory, you're supposed to burn the chametz. Now, if you're like myself, your children are all grown up, it's great to do that with the grandkids. But the idea is to remove the chametz from the house. I got some news for you. It's just not the kitchen alone. Do you sit on your couch and watch TV and eat your meals? You may have to clean the cracks out between the pillows on the couch or in the chair. When we do this, it is not to be restrictive, but in order to honor God. We, who have been given the privilege of being Jews or attached to Israel, okay, we have the privilege of honoring God because in the end, the chametz does represent a leavening in our life, a puffing up. As a matter of fact, in the Talmud it speaks of chametz in a figurative level, being the chametz of the soul, which causes a man to puff himself up. Within the Christian world, we would say that the chametz is a representation of sin, and I have to agree with that. So as we go through Passover, the idea is not just to clean the house and get rid of everything. It came from the 5 grains, and here's a quick test. What are the 5 grains? If you said wheat, oat, barley, spelt, and rye, then you're right. But we want to get rid of those things out of our lives also. We want to get rid of those things that somehow get between us and God. The subject of Passover is to hasten, to move, to be ready to go when the Lord calls. When God gave the command and Moses raised the staff and the people went forth, they knew it was God's call. It was time to move. Such is our lives. Who knows when the Messiah will call? We must be ready. So we rehearse and we practice Passover. Now, if this has been of some help to you, this little video, I'd be more than happy to give you the written material that I used in order to produce this. So if you would like to contact me, here is my email address. It's Shamash Ariel, SHAMMASHARIEL at hotmail.com. So send me an email and I'll send you a little 3-page resource for the future with its documentation. So just email me and I'll send you a copy. And if you're fortunate enough, and as we say every year, next year in Jerusalem,